Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
There's a place in New Orleans called the Brood Widow, a small, quiet cafe that never really fit in with the rest of the vibrant French Quarter. It didn't have the same flashy neon lights or loud music blaring from the bars. No, the Brood Widow was different. Dark wood, rich smells of coffee and pastries, and an old portrait of a woman hanging above the fireplace. The woman in the painting was beautiful, but her eyes, they were unsettling, too wide, too knowing. Locals would joke that the woman in the painting was the cafe's ghost, but that was all it was, a joke. At least that's what they thought until a strange customer started appearing. Her name was Anne. She came in every morning, always at the same time, 6:15 a.m. sharp. Always sat in the corner booth. She was pale, dressed in black, with long, dark hair that cascaded down her back like a veil. She never spoke much, just sipped her coffee and stared out the window. She wasn't a regular. In fact, none of the baristas could remember ever seeing her before she started showing up at that precise time. At first, no one thought anything of it. But then one morning, the barista named Sarah noticed something odd. Anne wasn't alone. She was talking to someone, a man, but no one else saw him. She leaned in closer and could see Anne's lips moving, but there was no sound. The man in the booth with her was just not there. Sarah asked the other barista, Rick, if he saw anything. Rick shook his head. "I don't see anyone," he said, but when Sarah turned to look again, Anne was still talking to empty air. Later that week, the weirdness deepened. Anne started ordering strange things. A cup of black, she'd say, then immediately look out the window. No sugar, no cream, just black. And then there were the scratches. She always left with scratches on her arms, thin, red lines like claw marks. At first, it seemed like she might have been doing it herself, but no one saw her do it. One day, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She'd watched Anne for weeks, seeing the same bizarre behavior, and finally, curiosity got the better of her. She walked up to the woman as she was sipping her black coffee. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice tentative. Anne looked up at Sarah, her eyes distant and hollow, like she hadn't really seen her. And then she smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm waiting for him," she said in a soft voice. "Who?" "The one in the painting," Anne whispered. She stood up and turned toward the portrait of the woman hanging above the fireplace. Sarah froze. She hadn't ever noticed it before, but the woman in the painting wasn't smiling now. Her eyes were wide, pleading, desperate. Anne followed Sarah's gaze. "Don't you see? He's coming for me. He's coming for us both." Before Sarah could respond, Anne left, her dark hair trailing behind her like smoke. That night, Sarah went home, her mind still spinning. The next morning, she found a strange package left at the cafe. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photograph was black and white, an old picture of a woman in a long black dress, standing in front of the very cafe. She looked familiar, but it was the letter that chilled her to the core. "He comes for those who walk alone, who stare too long at what they shouldn't. Anne isn't waiting for him anymore. She's already gone." It was signed, The Brood Widow. That was the last time Sarah saw Anne, or the woman in the painting, because when Sarah went in the next morning, the painting was gone. The wall was bare, and the space where it had been was just wrong, like something had been taken out of it, something important. But the cafe wasn't empty. The barista at the counter said Anne hadn't been seen in days. The other employees mentioned strange noises late at night, like scratching against the walls. And sometimes, when the wind hits the window just right, you might catch a glimpse of a woman in black standing across the street, watching the cafe through the glass. You could swear you see her eyes, wide, unblinking. And if you look for too long, you might feel the scratch of claws.
Story number 2.
There's a small coffee shop tucked in the corner of a narrow street in Asheville, North Carolina, called The Hidden Brew. The shop's unassuming exterior blends seamlessly with the brick buildings around it, but inside, it's a different world. Dark wood paneling lines the walls, low lighting gives the place a perpetual twilight feel, and the air smells like rich espresso mixed with something unsettling. For years, it had been a favorite spot for the locals, a quiet refuge to sip coffee and read, or talk with friends. The owners, a married couple named Tom and Margaret, were friendly but distant. Tom always had a faraway look in his eyes, and Margaret was the kind of person who never seemed to age. Her face was always smooth, her movements deliberate and graceful. But no one thought much about it. They were just a nice couple running a cozy cafe. That was until Sarah, a regular at the Hidden Brew, noticed something strange. Sarah had been coming to the cafe for months, always at the same time, around 3 p.m. Every day, she sat in the same chair by the window, her back to the wall. One afternoon, as she was sipping her coffee and gazing out at the quiet street, she saw something in the reflection of the window. It wasn't her own face. It was someone else's. A man, pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow. He was standing right behind her, staring at her with a cold, unnerving gaze. She spun around quickly, but there was no one there. Just the usual cozy atmosphere of the cafe. Shaking her head, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the next day, it happened again. Only this time, the man's face seemed clearer, more distinct. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to catch a glimpse of him directly. But again, there was no one behind her, just empty chairs and the hum of the coffee grinder. The third time was different. As Sarah was staring at the man's reflection, his lips moved, forming a word she couldn't quite hear. She leaned closer to the glass, trying to read his lips. "Help," he mouthed. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She decided to stay away from the cafe for a few days, hoping it would pass. But when she returned the following week, something was off. The atmosphere in the Hidden Brew was heavier, more oppressive. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt a chill run down her spine. The usual hum of the espresso machine felt distant, like it was coming from far away. Tom and Margaret greeted her as usual, but their smiles seemed strained, forced. They were standing a little too close to each other, their hands tightly gripped. As Sarah sat down in her usual spot by the window, she noticed that something had changed. The man in the reflection was no longer just standing behind her. Now, he was inside the cafe, walking toward her. She stood up quickly, but no one else seemed to notice the man. He moved silently, his face twisted in a grotesque grimace. She tried to shout to warn the other customers, but her voice wouldn't come. It was like she was trapped in a dream, unable to speak or move. The man reached out a hand toward her, his fingers long and pale, and just as his hand touched her shoulder, everything went black. When Sarah woke up, she was outside the cafe, lying on the cold pavement. Her head was pounding. She scrambled to her feet and rushed inside, but the place was empty, dark, abandoned. The lights were off, the chairs stacked up on the tables. The smell of coffee was gone, replaced by a stale, musty odor. Tom and Margaret were nowhere to be found. She turned to leave, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of the man's face in the window. Now on the other side, staring at her with those hollow, empty eyes. In a panic, Sarah fled the cafe. She didn't stop running until she reached her apartment, but even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She didn't return to the Hidden Brew after that. Months passed and the cafe remained closed. No one knew what happened to Tom and Margaret. Some locals said they moved away. Others said they'd simply vanished. But Sarah never forgot the man in the window. Every time she walked past that corner, she couldn't help but glance toward the darkened windows of the Hidden Brew, half expecting to see his face staring back at her. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, she swears she can still smell the faint, bitter scent of coffee, like it's calling her back.
Story number 3.
In a quiet, foggy town in the Pacific Northwest, there was a small cafe called Moss and Mocha. It was nestled between two older buildings on the edge of the woods, so far from the main road that most people didn't even know it existed. The cafe was owned by a reclusive man named Jacob, a man with a dark history no one really knew about. He was quiet, kept to himself, and the few who did interact with him described him as having unsettlingly pale skin and strange, almost predatory eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. The inside of Moss and Mocha had an eerie charm. Old wooden beams, low-hanging light fixtures, and mismatched furniture gave the place a vintage, almost haunted atmosphere. The walls were adorned with black and white photos of forests and fog, all framed in thick, ornate frames. The smell of coffee mixed with the damp scent of moss that crept in from the woods. Customers who came in often spoke of feeling like they were being watched, but they could never quite figure out by whom. The first strange thing happened one rainy evening. A couple, newly engaged, stopped by after hiking in the nearby woods. They were soaked to the bone, and the warmth of the cafe was a relief. The woman, Emily, ordered a mocha, and her fiancé Marcus chose a cappuccino. They sat by the window, watching the rain pour down in sheets. Jacob, the owner, was behind the counter as usual, his eyes flicking toward them as he prepared their drinks. When he handed Emily her mocha, their fingers brushed briefly. Emily's skin went cold for a second, but she thought nothing of it. Jacob's fingers were icy, but it was a damp evening, and she assumed he'd just been working with cold milk or ice. But then, about 10 minutes later, Emily felt something odd. The air around her seemed to chill even more. Her fingers were trembling as she held her cup. She looked at the window, no longer just rain. There were figures standing outside. They were silhouettes, distorted by the fog, but they seemed to be watching her through the glass. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer to Marcus, pointing toward the window. He looked, but there was nothing there. "Must have been the reflection," he said, brushing it off with a smile. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When they left the cafe later that evening, Jacob was standing by the door, watching them. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and his mouth hung open slightly like he was waiting for something or someone. Emily turned away quickly, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as they made their way to their car. The night was unnaturally quiet, as if the world around them had been muted. That night, neither of them could sleep. Emily had strange dreams, dreams of the woods, of being trapped in the trees, of hands reaching from the moss-covered ground, pulling her down into the earth. She woke up to the sound of someone knocking on her window, but when she opened the blinds, no one was there. The next morning, they returned to the cafe to find that Jacob had closed it for the day. As they walked to the door, Emily noticed something odd. There, at the bottom of the doorframe, was a small, freshly turned patch of earth, like someone had been digging there recently. She bent down, feeling a cold shiver run through her. The door opened behind her. It was Jacob. "You should leave the woods alone," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Marcus asked him what he meant, but Jacob only gave a half smile. "There are things out there, in the trees, things that wait for the right moment." The couple didn't return to Mas and Mocha after that. They told their friends about the strange feeling they had, about the coldness that seemed to follow them out of the cafe. Most people shrugged it off, but something had changed in the town after that night. A week later, another hiker, this one a local, went missing in the woods near Mas and Mocha. She was last seen walking toward the cafe, but she never made it back to town. Search parties scoured the woods, but there was no trace of her. Not even a footprint. The whispers about Jacob grew. People started to avoid the cafe, but still, Jacob remained. The lights of Mas and Mocha flickered at night, even though no one entered. Every now and then, someone passing by would claim to see Jacob standing at the window, his pale face pressed against the glass, his mouth stretched in a grin. As time passed, the cafe grew emptier, the air heavier, and still, the forest behind it crept forward, pushing its moss and vines closer to the walls. Some say Jacob was never really the owner, that he had been waiting for something, waiting for them, the creatures that lived in the woods, that they were the ones who called him, drew him in. Others say he's still there, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of stepping too close to the woods, too close to him. And if you're ever in that part of the Pacific Northwest, lost in the fog and looking for a cup of coffee, be careful which door you open, because some doors, once they're opened, don't let you leave.
Story number 4.
There's a quiet little cafe in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, called the Red Lantern. On the outside, it looks like just another charming coffee shop. Brick walls covered in ivy, small tables scattered around a shaded porch, and lanterns hanging in the windows that cast a warm, inviting glow when the sun sets. But as many regulars will tell you, there's more to the Red Lantern than meets the eye. The cafe has been around for over 50 years, and it's been a staple in the community, but only a few people know about the cafe's dark history. The original owner, a woman named Eleanor, had been a well-liked figure in town. She ran the cafe with a quiet grace, always serving up the best pastries and the richest coffee. People would come and go, the cafe becoming a place for quiet conversations, writers drafting stories, and musicians composing songs. But when Eleanor passed away unexpectedly in 1978, things began to change. Her daughter, Abigail, inherited the cafe, but she was never quite the same. She was withdrawn, almost cold, and spent more time locked away in the back room than greeting customers. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. The staff noticed that the lights in the cafe would flicker at odd hours. Sometimes the temperature would drop suddenly, and every so often, customers reported hearing someone whispering their name, even when they were alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a young couple sat by the window, enjoying their evening coffee. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant sound of rain hitting the pavement filled the air. They noticed something odd. The red lanterns hanging outside the cafe, usually dim but warm, were glowing brighter than usual, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The couple tried to ignore it, but the whispers began. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. They tried to brush it off as a trick of the wind, but then they noticed something that made their blood run cold. From the corner of the cafe, near the back room where Abigail used to spend all her time, there was a figure standing in the shadows. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned apron, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair. Her presence was unsettling, like a memory trying to surface. The couple stared, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The woman wasn't moving. She wasn't even breathing. And when the man tried to speak to her, his voice caught in his throat, as though the air around her had thickened to the point where it was suffocating him. They stood up, intending to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained locked. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, more distinct, like dozens of voices layered over each other. Then the woman in the corner moved. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, her face still hidden behind her dark hair. Suddenly, the lanterns outside the cafe dimmed, and in the faint light, the couple could make out the woman's face. Her eyes were empty, black pits where pupils should have been, and her mouth was twisted into a smile that stretched too far, too wide. The man screamed, and in that moment, everything went black. When the police arrived, the couple was gone. Their table was empty, the coffee cups overturned, but there was no sign of struggle, no sign of where they had gone. The only thing left behind was the faint scent of something burning, like the smell of old wood. The cafe was closed for several days while the authorities investigated, but no one could find any trace of Abigail or the young couple. The cafe reopened, but it was never quite the same. The whispers persisted, the lanterns flickered at odd hours, and the people who came to visit all spoke of an unsettling presence they couldn't shake. Years passed, and the Red Lantern became something of a local legend. Some people claimed to see the woman in the corner, others heard the whispers, but few stayed long enough to investigate. The cafe eventually became a place for tourists, those looking for a quaint escape from the modern world. But every so often, when the lanterns glowed just a little too brightly, and the whispers filled the air like a forgotten song, someone would disappear. No one has seen Abigail since that night. The back room remains locked, though no one ever remembers seeing anyone go inside. And sometimes, if you're sitting near the back of the cafe, you might catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of your eye. A shadow, a movement, the flicker of something, or someone, watching you from the dark. Some say Abigail never left, that she's still there, waiting for someone to join her. And if you stay too long, if you linger in the wrong corner, you might just find yourself trapped in the cafe forever, another shadow in the dark, another whisper in the walls. And the red lanterns? They burn a little brighter every year.
Story number 5.
In the heart of a sleepy town in Pennsylvania stood the Hollow Bean, a quaint coffee shop that had been passed down through generations. The owners, a couple named Victor and Liza, had inherited the shop from Victor's grandmother, who had run it with the kind of precision and care that could only be forged through decades of experience. But what they didn't know, what no one in town knew, was that the cafe had always been different. It was built on land that had once been part of an old farm, a farm with a history steeped in strange occurrences and even stranger disappearances. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. The coffee was good, the pastries delicious, and the customers were as friendly as small-town folks should be. The couple worked tirelessly, maintaining the charm of the shop, keeping the same cozy, warm atmosphere their predecessors had nurtured. The walls were decorated with photos of the town from the early 1900s, the kind that always seemed to look back at you with an unnerving clarity. But after a few months, things began to shift. It started with the smell. Victor was the first to notice it one morning. It was faint at first, just a trace of something burnt lingering in the air. The cafe had an old-fashioned oven in the back, so it wasn't unusual for a scent to seep through, but this wasn't the kind of smell that came from a baking mistake. This was something darker, something older. He asked Liza if she smelled it, but she didn't. Days passed and the scent grew stronger. It was there every morning when he opened the cafe, lingering like an unwanted guest. It had a sickly sweet undertone to it, like something rotting beneath the surface. Customers would comment on it too. They'd wrinkle their noses, mutter about the odd smell, and then get distracted by their cups of coffee or the small talk around them. But no one seemed to care enough to leave. Then came the cold. One day, in the middle of the summer, when the sun was high and the air thick with humidity, a biting chill swept through the cafe. Victor and Liza stood at the counter, their breaths fogging up in front of them as the temperature plummeted inexplicably. The windows frosted over. It was as if the building itself had suddenly been overtaken by winter. Victor rushed to check the old heating system, but it was fine, working as it should. The next day it happened again, and the day after that. Each time the cold would come, intense and bone deep, and it would only last for an hour or so before it disappeared as quickly as it had come. But each time it lingered longer, and each time the smell grew stronger, that foul, decaying sweetness filling the air, choking the breath of anyone who stepped inside. Victor couldn't ignore it any longer. He started digging through the old journals and ledgers his grandmother had kept, hoping to find a clue, some explanation for the growing unease. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The farm that had once been here had a strange history. People who lived on the land spoke of something buried beneath the soil, something alive that they could never quite describe. Over the years, children had gone missing, people had vanished, and the land itself seemed to refuse to yield any crops. In the journals, Victor found mention of a curse, something tied to the very foundation of the land, an ancient malevolent force that had been bound to the place in the early 1800s. And then there was the most chilling part. The hollow being wasn't just built on that land. It was built on top of what was once the site of a makeshift burial ground. According to the journals, the bodies of the missing townsfolk had never been properly laid to rest. Instead, they had been hastily buried by the townspeople, too scared to do the right thing, too fearful of what was lurking beneath. One night, Victor and Liza decided to close the cafe early, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. They went down to the basement, a small, musty space beneath the cafe that had always felt wrong. The further they descended, the colder it became, until their breath hung visibly in the air. As they reached the floor below, they noticed something strange, a faint glow emanating from beneath a pile of old crates. With trepidation, they moved the crates aside, revealing a small, old wooden door. The door, unlike anything in the cafe, seemed out of place, as if it had been hidden away, forgotten. When they opened it, they were met with a stench so overpowering that it nearly knocked them off their feet. The air was thick, heavy with rot and decay. But beyond the door was not just an old cellar or storage room. It was a chamber, one lined with strange symbols carved deep into the stone walls. At the center of the room was a shallow pool, filled with murky, black water that seemed to shift and move of its own accord. As Victor stepped closer, he felt a pull, a compulsion to look into the water. And when he did, he saw something. Not his reflection, but the reflection of a face, twisted and deformed, with hollow eyes staring back at him. Suddenly, Liza screamed. The water began to ripple, and shadows in the corner of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward them like dark fingers reaching out of the depths. Victor tried to pull her away, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the room. They heard whispers, low and guttural, growing louder, and then a voice. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed. "The curse has been waiting for you." The walls of the room began to close in. The temperature dropped even further until they could see the frost forming on their skin. In that moment, they understood the truth. The cafe, the land it was built on, had never been free of the curse. It was waiting, feeding on the living, drawing in those who dared to open the door, to uncover the secrets buried beneath the soil. The last thing they heard before everything went dark was the sound of the water sloshing and the whisper of 1,000 voices murmuring from the depths, "Join us!" The next morning, the hollow bean was empty. No trace of Victor or Liza, no sign they had ever existed. The door to the basement was locked, the smell of decay and rot gone, replaced by the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee. But if you walk past the cafe at night, especially when the fog rolls in thick from the woods, you might hear faint whispers coming from inside, beckoning you closer. And if you look into the windows, you might just catch a glimpse of 2 faces, watching you from the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul to open the door.
Story number 6.
There was an old, nearly forgotten coffee shop at the edge of a sleepy town in Oregon called the Moonlit Brew. It was tucked away on a narrow alley, and most people didn't even know it existed unless they had lived in the town for a long time. The building was aged, with cracked windows and ivy creeping up the sides, yet there was always a faint light glowing from within, like it was alive, waiting for someone to stumble inside. The shop had always been a place where the few locals would stop by, mostly elderly patrons who came for their daily cups of coffee or tea and a slice of something homemade. The place wasn't known for its fancy drinks or beautiful decor. In fact, most people would say the furniture was old and uncomfortable, and the coffee never seemed as good as it should have been. But there was something about the Moonlit Brew that made you want to return. Something inviting. It was the smell, mostly. It was a blend of coffee, something sweet like cinnamon, and an undertone of something that you couldn't quite place. A subtle metallic scent that seemed to cling to your clothes and skin long after you left. Most people couldn't identify it, and some who tried would simply smile awkwardly and say, "It's just the coffee." But a few newcomers, including one woman named Sarah, didn't get the same sense of warmth the others felt. She had moved to the town recently, and being a coffee enthusiast, she decided to give the shop a try, ignoring the rumors she had heard. When she first entered the Moonlit Brew, she immediately noticed how cold it was. The front door opened with a creak, and the faint hum of a ceiling fan swayed above her. She stepped inside, and the air seemed to thicken, as though the atmosphere had weight to it. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white pictures of the town mostly. The faces in those photos seemed to stare at her from their frames, and for a moment, she thought she saw one of them move. But when she blinked, it was just an illusion. Sarah ordered a cup of coffee from the woman behind the counter, an older lady who smiled too widely for comfort. The woman handed her the cup without a word, and Sarah sat down at one of the small, wobbly tables in the corner, next to a dusty window. As Sarah sipped the coffee, she felt an odd sensation creeping over her, like someone was standing too close, watching her from behind. But when she looked around, no one else was there, only the elderly patrons in the far corner, chatting quietly among themselves, and the woman behind the counter who seemed to be staring at her with an intensity that was almost unnatural. She tried to ignore the feeling, but it gnawed at her. Something was wrong, and the coffee seemed to be getting stronger, making her head spin just a little. Then she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a shadow, dark and shifting, stretching across the floor, moving slowly like it was alive. She blinked, and the shadow stopped moving, freezing just at the edge of her vision. "Are you all right, dear?" The voice came from behind her, startling her. It was the woman who had served her the coffee, and now standing beside her, her face inches from Sarah's. Startled, Sarah nodded, unsure of what to say. The woman's eyes were too wide, almost too bright. "You should stay a little longer," she said, her voice too soft, almost coaxing. "It's good for the soul. The brew has a way of making things clearer, you know?" Sarah smiled awkwardly and stood up to leave, but the woman's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, her grip far too tight. "It's not good to leave too soon," the woman whispered, her breath cold against Sarah's ear. "Not when it's your turn." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She yanked her wrist free, but the woman's cold, vacant stare followed her all the way to the door. As Sarah stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. That night, Sarah tossed and turned in bed, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back from the cafe. Her skin felt clammy, her head still foggy from the coffee she had drunk. She got up to get a glass of water, but as she passed the bathroom mirror, something caught her eye. Her reflection wasn't quite right. It was slightly delayed, as though the image in the mirror was moving independently of her. And in the reflection, there was a shadow standing just behind her, a shape too dark, too heavy to be a mere trick of the light. She spun around, but there was nothing there. For the next several nights, the same thing happened. She'd wake in the middle of the night to strange whispers, and sometimes she could swear she saw shadows flitting at the edge of her vision, always in the dark corners of her apartment. Sometimes she'd hear soft footsteps behind her, and when she turned, nothing would be there. But the worst part came when she noticed the photographs in her apartment, pictures she had never remembered taking. But there they were, framed and resting on her shelves. Photos of the moonlit brew, of the elderly patrons, and of her sitting at that same corner table with the woman behind the counter watching her, her eyes wide and predatory. It was then that Sarah realized the coffee shop wasn't just a cafe. It was a trap. She couldn't leave. The brew had claimed her, just as it had claimed others before her. And now she was a part of the picture, a shadow in the background, just another face on the wall. The next morning, Sarah's apartment was empty. Her friends went by the cafe asking the locals if they'd seen her, but they only received polite smiles in return. And the woman behind the counter? She was still there, waiting for the next soul to wander in. The door to Moonlit Brew was always open, the warm light glowing softly from within. But if you walked past it at night, you might feel an eerie pull, a compulsion to step inside. Just remember this. If you sit down, if you take a sip of the coffee, you might never leave. And one day when someone looks at the pictures in that cafe, they'll see your face too, staring back from the wall, frozen in time.